Hey there, and welcome to Gyroscope Farm and Traveling Homesteader. Today I'm going to be transplanting some blueberries, but I had to go back a little bit to make some explanation. So, because I've moved so much, I ended up making a lot of my plants. I shouldn't say making my plants, but putting my plants into pots. So, a lot of times you'll see where I live that I'll have a lot of potted plants because I've brought them from place to place. And so, today, the plants that I'm actually going to be transplanting, I got about maybe 4 years ago, and they've actually really outgrown their plants, and I should have transplanted them last year or the year before. But I'm going to transplant them this year, and they're about half the amount of blueberries that I have. I have about 11, 12 plants, and today I'm going to be transplanting 6 of them. And basically, what I'm going to do is it's a combination of not only transplanting, but manure. Some of the soil that I've decided to use, I've actually used a friend's composted horse manure. So I'll insert some of that information too. And basically, I've chosen horse manure because one, I got a friend who has horses. Two, it's easily available. And three, the compost I found is really, it really helps my plants. And it's a strange thing. A friend of mine up the road used to raise alpacas, and I found that she had said, and other alpaca owners had said that alpaca manure you can actually use right fresh. If they poop it out, you can take it and put it on a plant to help fertilize it. Um, Otherwise, most other manures you do need to compost for a period of time so it breaks down and isn't what they call hot. And horse manure is one of those hot manures that needs to be broken down for a period of time, usually about 6 months to a year before it actually can be used on a garden. But the strange thing about the alpaca manure is that while one, it was able to produce beautiful looking plants. I mean, my friend's garden looked great, and you couldn't have seen a better garden. But it was really strange. For as big as her produce got and her fruits got, it didn't have any taste. And the only thing I could attribute that to was maybe the type of compost or manure that she used in her garden. Now, I could be totally wrong, but that was the only connection that I could see. She watered them regularly, used similar or same plants that I did, but it just came down to the compost. So, I just have a tendency to lean more towards horse manure because one, that's what I've had, and I have friends who have horses. But two, I've also leaned towards cow manure when I've gotten it at the store, or steer compost. So today we're going to look at kind of combining some of the soils from pots I've had along with more horse manure for my blueberries. But along with that, I'll be showing you my garden that I have a new place for my garden that I've been working on. So let's check that out. So these are some of my potted plants. As you can see, I've already potted 2 tomatoes this year. And I have some lemon balm and some iris. And that middle red item is actually just a water holder from my spout up there. Just rain runoff. And then I have a fig that I got last year with some iris in there. And believe it or not, I've actually, right next to it, I had some strawberries that have been doing pretty well, but one of them made haste over in the pot next door, and so it started growing there too, with the flamingos. And I like to combine a lot of things when I can, and in this particular pot we have oregano, rosemary, and yarrow. So that's why that has a combination of things. And with where I live in Oregon, we have our natural state weed of blackberries. So I have my own little blackberry patch there too. But this is my new garden area, and I've decided to clear off the hillside, and it's still coming along, but we had some flowers already planted here. My mom actually started planting some flowers in the hillside, and we have some more lemon balm and daisies and some more lemon balm up top. And so I'll be planting along this hillside, and there are the blueberries that we'll be transplanting today with using some of this horse manure. And this is some purchased compost that I got this year as well. That has, it's just a little bit more commercial. But these are some of the pots that I have that I'll be combining. And I've already put the soil from this big pot into uh, my wheelbarrow here, and I'll be mixing up some of the other remaining soils and a pot of horse manure to then put back into these pots and put some of the blueberries in. Now these are my little blueberries that should have been transplanted last year. Since they're not going to be producing that many blueberries, if any at all this year, this was the time that I thought I should do it and give them a chance to grow and produce. But then we'll be putting them out here and helping them with some of my other plants that I'll be planting shortly as well. Right now I'm mixing up my potting soil from the soil that I had before. And basically one thing you might want to consider is if you're using potting soil like this that you have left over, when you dump it out, you'll probably see a fair amount of root systems from past plants. And so you'll want to break it up and make sure to get as much of the old root systems out. And in my case, this is from a bunch from a past pot. So I just separate it out and make sure that I just try to keep as much of the soil as I can, so that way my current plants can get as much nutrients as they can. But also my pots are pretty big, so I want to make sure that they can be filled rather than have whole low amounts of soil in them. So if you just break it up, and as you go through, you'll see the old clumps of roots from other plants. And then as you get in, you can start mixing the soil that you have. Now, you might notice in this set of soil that I have some white stuff in there. I happen to go through and I really liked what a guy named Mel Bartholomew says. He's the author of Square Foot Gardening, and he uses something that he calls Mel's Mix. And it's a combination of equal parts vermiculite, peat moss, and compost. And the vermiculite and peat moss you generally put in just at first. And then through the years, as you continue to garden in your pots or raised beds, you end up continuing to add more compost. So then your plants become get more nutrition each year. And so that's why you'll see the white items in my soil, because it's vermiculite. I actually have used both vermiculite and perlite, I believe. And so they kind of go back and forth. They both have benefits to your soils, but it just depends on kind of what I remember when I particularly feel like adding to my soil. So as you can see, I'm continuing to break up my soil and take out little bits of roots, and take out these little handy dandy weeds that may have grown along the way. Now too, another thing you might want to be aware of is depending on where you get your compost. In my case, my friend who I get my horse compost from, in her area she's laid down in some of her pasture areas and stalls, they have rock. So a lot of times I'll find, based on what they've cleaned out of their stalls, in addition to the manure, I'll also see some of this rock. And so that's something else that if you, on one hand the rocks are okay because they offer some drainage, but on the other hand, you want to be careful of having too much. So I kind of am middle of the road about it, but just be careful that you don't get too much, and realize too that what is fed to the animals from where you get your compost will come into your soil. So you may get some different types of weeds than other people, depending on where you get your compost from. In my case, my friend Mary gets local hay, and the local hay has pretty good, the fields are pretty good and they don't have too many weeds in them. So I don't really have to worry that much about that. So it's not only getting your compost or manure from one place, but then where do they get their feed from that could potentially have issues with your soil. So the next part to this mix is my new horse manure. So dumping that in, I'm just going to literally dump it in and mix. Now, and a little bit of a feature I'll probably put in here. When I first got this a couple days ago from Mary's place, this is the most recent, newest compost I could get that's fully decomposed. Here you can see in this handy dandy chunk, and yeah, it's manure, kind of, sort of, but you can see that there's different parts to it. Mainly, it's decomposed manure clearly, but also it has sawdust in it, which is very helpful in my case for my blueberries because they like nitrogen and all that sort of good stuff. So as I mix this all in together, I'm going to hopefully have a good mix of soils that I'll be able to let my blueberries grow in. And again, I like to just clump up, make all my clumps kind of go away so that it ends up having more even distribution throughout my soil. So as I continue to mix, I like to know that it's just all kind of going to come together well. And believe it or not, I just had a chunk there that was still warm from the compost pile that I got this from. And having warmth in your soil is just fine. I found that when I had my raised beds out of wine bottles, that raised bed actually produced really good garlic and tomatoes because of the added heat in the bed. So that's kind of something else to consider too, is how much heat your bed can actually radiate. So now that we got this pretty much mixed up, we are going to then put it back into the pots. So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually plant our blueberry, and in this particular pot is the mix that we just did in our wheelbarrow. But because it's still so dry, I'm going to actually just really wet this down really pretty good with, of course, the handy dandy hose. And so by doing this, you're making sure that the root system of the plant can actually get all the water it can right away. I got taught a little bit in the old school way that you'll water your soil, put your plant in, hopefully with the root balls wet, and then you put all the remaining soil on top and you water it again. And this is probably the one time that you're going to do so much watering of a plant, but that way it helps the root system actually get established. And so it's funny, I actually found myself planting trees at one farm at an organic sheep farm, and we were doing a riparian area, and a neighbor came by and said, "Oh, you don't need to water that much. That's just a fir tree. You don't need to do that." And I was like, "Well, I was told to do it this way," and that was about 15 years ago, and those plants are now 30, 60 feet tall and are doing great. So I'm kind of proud of my little riparian plants. So once we get this all nice and damp, and you can actually kind of hear it puddling, and it's going to sound a little soupy for a little while. But as I then kind of dig a bit of a hole out, the water does go down further into the soil. And as you may have noticed before, when I was doing mixing my soil, it was very dry. And if you mix it dry, it's a little easier to maneuver, but then when you put it in the container like this, having it all nice and wet as you let it go down into the soil, or down into the pot, it helps the root ball a little bit better. Now, I did already add horse compost, which is part of the mix that I like to make. But as you may have noticed before when I showed you my garden, I also had a bag of other compost, and this is a nice, really dark, rich compost. It's not organic, and some people would prefer to go all organic. I happen to get this at a local hardware store, and it was reasonably priced, and it was what I needed for the time. I don't mind using it as a starter, but I do try to get as organic soils as I can, just because it's kind of one of those things, what you put into your plants goes into you. And so you want to make sure that if you're going to be eating healthy vegetables, eat healthy vegetables, I guess. But this will help these get started and going, and hopefully these blueberries will be with me for years to come. So I put a couple handfuls, 4 or 5 handfuls of this in, mix it a little bit, add a little bit more water to that, and then I can get my blueberries. So now that I have my blueberries, now after transplanting another blueberry yesterday and breaking off one of the stems, one thing to be careful of is that you want to make sure, if it's in a container like this and it has a lot of hard soil like we've been having, where I live there's a lot of hard soil in the summers, and even though it's June right now, it's been pretty dry. And so you want to kind of squish your pot to help release the soil. And if you can, like there's some holes in the bottoms here, if you can kind of press on that a little bit to help release the pot and kind of bang on it to help the root system come out, then you won't hurt the plant as much, which will help the transition a lot better. So with those little tricks, you then simply pull the root out, and you can see that this is pretty stiff. And so on the bottom, you want to just make sure that you kind of let the root system kind of come out a little bit, so it'll percolate a little bit better when you do this. When you you encourage the roots to find their water and grow when you kind of poke at it like this. Plus, it allows more of the soil to mix together, and that helps too. So when you do this, simply find your hole, make the hole in here, plot it in, and then scoop it together. And what I like to do, after hiding behind the plant, is add some more soil on the top. So once you do that, you're all set, and you're ready to water it again. So now I've added some more of the first compost mix that I put together right on top. And now I'll just take it and water it down again to help it ensure that it has the best chance of kind of staying alive and thriving. And hopefully this plant will look better in the next couple of months. It'll actually grow a lot. And while it is June and most blueberries will be producing their berries here within the next month or so, these, because the pots were so small, I didn't see them producing this year. So this year I'm just asking them to grow and to actually get a lot bigger. So that's why I'm not really worried about transplanting these right now. So with that in mind, do consider when things are blooming and when things are going to be actually producing their product, in this case blueberries, because you may want to adjust your time for transplant. So with that in mind, I hope that this was helpful for you. And if you have any suggestions or questions, just put them in the comment box below. And remember to subscribe to The Traveling Homesteader and check out our farm page at gyroscopefarm.com. And I hope you have a great time planting.